Good afternoon. Thank you, Wolfgang. I'd like to particularly thank my good friend Herwig Schoper, who is your former director here, longest-serving director at Cern. Looking back at the history of the World Academy of Art and Science, which I represent, physicists have always had a very influential role. Among our charter members who founded the organization in 1960 was a physicist who coined that interesting phrase, spooky at a distance, another one who chaired the Manhattan Project, and a third one who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1995 for trying to abolish the nuclear weapons that were created by the Manhattan Project. Today, we have on our board, I counted this morning, 25% of our board members are physicists, most of them nuclear particle physicists, theoretical physicists. Fortunately, today I'm not going to speak about physics. That's fortunate for you since that's not my qualification. But I hope that the topics I raise today will convince you that there's something that we can learn from each other and benefit from each other, and I'm going to do that by raising some questions that we have been grappling within the Academy, and which I think a dialogue in different forms, this being one of them, with organizations, fine institutions like Cern, can be helpful in resolving or addressing. Today, we live in unique times. Unprecedented opportunities and unimaginable challenges going side by side. The world today has the capacity to feed, clothe, house, and educate every human being. Productive potential, but we're far from doing that. We have today about $225 trillion in global financial assets, and yet fine institutions like this and organizations and people all over the world are feeling the constraints imposed by a shortage of funds. It turns out that only about 20% of that money is actually going for any purpose related to either productivity or human welfare. So it's not a shortage of potential that we have, but it may be a shortage in the way, or difficulties and shortfalls in the way we're managing those assets. We have, according to ILO, about 200 million unemployed people, but if you really scratch the surface and think about underemployment, it's probably far over 1 billion, which in terms of utilization of resources doesn't fare very well. We've got the most precious human resource, and we fall far short in the way we develop that resource and the way we utilize that resource for the benefit of humanity. We have all types of challenges, which we're all aware of because we can't miss it with the media: social unrest, civil wars, proliferation of nuclear weapons, climate change, and so forth. Today, if we wanted to raise levels of higher education up to a graduate level all over the world, we would need to expand our educational capacity by about 350 million seats in universities and colleges around the world. That would be to increase capacity by about 4 or 5-fold. Something that clearly is not going to happen in the very near future or in the next few decades through the traditional means that we've been using for education up until now. At the same time, we have a revolution going on in the field of higher education. Maybe revolution's too big a word. We have the beginnings of stirrings of some very exciting changes, maybe the first real paradigm change in education in more than a century, which offer a possibility of radically accelerating and expanding the reach and hopefully increasing the quality and changing the content of education at the same time. So a lot of things going on, pluses and minuses. All of this potential and all of these challenges relate to the presence of science. Science has contributed to creating the productive potentials, certainly the communication and transportation potentials, the rapid development of knowledge that we have today. At the same time, science is intimately connected with some of the problems that we're trying to address in terms of how science is being applied, whether it's in the proliferation of weapons or in the expansion of industrial capacities. So science is central to the issue. The World Academy was started essentially by a group of leading intellectuals who were concerned with the policy implications and social consequences of knowledge. And today, after 60 years, the Academy is trying to look at these types of issues that I briefly mentioned today and see where we need advances in our basic conceptual understanding in order to more effectively grapple with the challenges and meet the opportunities. My purpose today is, the theme I've chosen for today is to ask the question, what can we learn about how to do this better through a dialogue of natural scientists and social scientists? Now, the idea that the social scientists can learn from natural scientists is not a new idea. In fact, social science grew out of the natural sciences and has tried in many cases to imitate and base itself on the principles of natural science all along. To some extent for benefit, to some extent I would argue appropriately, and some extent inappropriately, and I'd like to explore some of those issues today. But in spite of the fact that this discussion has gone on for a long time, we in the Academy feel there are some unanswered questions and unexplored territory that could benefit from a further fruitful exchange. I'd like to chart out some of that territory, raise some of the questions, and see whether or not there's any resonance with people here. I'd like to stay at the outset with a brief time frame. I can't be qualifying every statement I make, so I'll do my qualifications in the beginning. I understand, my purpose here is not to criticize the social scientists. I am a social scientist. I work with social scientists all the time. My purpose is only to see how we can develop more effective knowledge. Every statement I'm going to make about the social sciences, at least, has its exceptions, and I'm not going to qualify them all to recognize those exceptions. So I hope you'll take this with an uncomfortable degree of generalization, especially uncomfortable for particle physicists who are used to great clarity of definition and precision and data to support it. I'd like to just start by recognizing at the outset three fundamental ways in which I think this comparison is not necessarily inappropriate, but I recognize from the beginning that there are some fundamental differences between the two fields, and I'd like to just acknowledge them at the beginning. The first difference is the magnitudes of complexity. In recent decades, science, the natural sciences, physics, and others have made significant progress in dealing with complexity, using nonlinear mathematics to handle things that were formerly outside the reach. But it seems to me that the complexity we're dealing with in the social sciences, in the human sciences, is greater than anything that we normally find in the physical world. For the reason that complexity is occurring at more than one plane. There's not just the physical complexity of interactions, which is the field of physics. We have the complexity of social interactions between people and events, and we have the psychological complexity of mental and emotional experiences which are going on inside us all the time. So in one case, things are very much heightened, which doesn't mean that social science can't learn anything about complexity from the physical sciences as long as we're aware of the differences. To illustrate that, in 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became President of the United States at an unenviable period. It was 3 years after the Great Crash and right in the middle of the Great Depression. There was a panic going on throughout America, a panic in the banking industry. 6,000 banks had closed within this 3-year period in spite of the best advice available from economists at the time as to how to deal with the financial collapse following the crash and the depression. There was no known good solution to stopping a banking panic, for the simple reason is the more people who took their money out of the bank in fear of the panic, the more in fear of bankruptcies, the more banks collapsed, because no bank keeps all of their money waiting for it to be withdrawn. Roosevelt came to assumed office, and the first thing he did was he declared a 5-day banking holiday. And on the 5th day, he got on the radio, a technological innovation, and he addressed the American people for the first of what became his famous fireside chats. And he said, "Our country is in the midst of the greatest challenge it's ever faced. But let us look at the real situation. All the vast natural resources that made this the most prosperous country in the world, and it already was for quite some time by then, are still there. All the talents and skills and work ethic of our people that made this country so successful are still there. We have everything we had before, except now we're afraid." And his famous phrase in that fireside chat was, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." And so the advice he gave, or the economic policy he followed, was he addressed the American people and said, "Monday morning I'm going to open the banks. I want you to go to the bank on Monday morning, line up as you were the day before, but instead of drawing your money out in panic, I want you to put your money into the bank." And the following Monday, when the banks opened, the lines formed as they had in previous months, but this time the majority of the people were putting the money back and the panic was overcome. This does not conform to any known principle or law of economics that you deal with a banking crisis by talking to the people and asking them to act in a way that's almost diametrically opposed to what they perceive as their best interests. But it worked. It illustrates the complexity that we're talking about in the social sciences, and so with a good deal of compassion we can talk about some of the problems that are there in the social sciences as well. The second exception is the nature of the reality that we are grappling with. In the physical sciences, the natural sciences, the reality we're grappling with is something outside. It may be very small or very great, but it is outside ourselves, and we deal with it as an objective reality. Objectivity is a very important word for us. Thanks to particle physicists, we now know there's something called the observer effect, and we're really not totally independent of that reality we're observing. But anyway, we think of the reality we're studying as something other than ourself, objective. Whereas in the social sciences, we have a problem of subjectivity, which is not just the fact that I bring to my study prejudices and preconceptions and conceptual framework that I impose on reality. We can do that in any field of inquiry. But because the reality that I'm studying itself, the object itself is a subject. The object itself is conscious. The object itself has thoughts and feelings, aspirations and impulses which impact on the reality, and it is the subjective nature of economics which FDR recognized. And it was that subjective reality that he addressed when he said, I'm not going to try to fix the system only, I'm going to ask you to change your behavior, to change your understanding, to change your attitude. So it adds to, no doubt adds to the complexity. Another obvious example of that, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, is the placebo effect. The placebo effect, in which physicians give a medicine to a patient and find out, even if they give a drug that's not really a drug, but just a glorified piece of candy, about, on average, it varies from condition to condition, somewhere between 20 and 40% of the patients report a benefit, a measurable, noticeable benefit, many times a physically monitored benefit, from not receiving a real drug, but from receiving a placebo. And one of the problems of this placebo effect is that it's increasing over time. It's getting more difficult for the pharmaceutical companies to get a new drug registered, because they must be able to prove first that it's statistically more powerful, in a statistically significant way more powerful than a placebo. And that's becoming more difficult because placebos are becoming more powerful, which I guess means our faith in medicine and physicians is becoming more powerful. So we're not just dealing with an objective reality, we're dealing with a subjective one. The third exception or difference I wanted to highlight is about the aims of science. I think the aims of science are broad-based and we can include everything, but if you want to go primarily, most natural scientists would say, the fundamental aim is we want knowledge. We want the truth. The application of that truth for the benefit of society is very important, no doubt about it. But even if it wasn't important, the science and the pursuit of that truth is valuable in itself. So the knowledge comes first. Whereas in the social sciences, we have to question, is the knowledge itself more important, or is its results more important? Karl Popper has written a lot about this and argued that in the social sciences, the consequences, the practical success of the application of knowledge is more important than the knowledge itself. Many things that pass for economics today are traced back to Adam Smith, who's supposed to have been the founder of economics, but Smith never considered himself an economist. He considered himself a moral philosopher. His purpose was not to discover natural laws of economy, wherever, if they ever existed. His purpose was to benefit society. He was very clear about that, and what he proposed in a very non-doctrinaire way, were strategies or policies that he thought would do that, and the rational justification for it. He never intended to pronounce laws of nature that govern the way human beings function, that we must live with those forever after. Another interesting area is the concept of natural law itself. It's pretty straightforward in the natural sciences, that science is looking for the recurring patterns, the consistent behavior in the universe, orderliness, necessity, the action of chance. But when it comes to the social sciences, there has been a tendency to try to imitate and find the same types of laws that are prevalent in the natural sciences. This has given rise to what I and my colleagues refer to as Newtonian economics. As I said, I have a lot of friends who are physicists, and I found my physicist friends seem to understand economics and the laws of economics better than a lot of people in the social sciences, because They understand the difference between a law of nature, an immutable law of nature, and the principles that are governing the way our economies work today, which is very much a question of values, very much a question of choices that are being made. The problem we have is that many of us believe that this is the way economics has to be, that there is no choice, given the laws of economics, that we have to accept that this is the way economics functions. We have to accept a certain level of unemployment. I don't believe it's true. If the world decides tomorrow that it wants to wipe out unemployment, it can do that. If it wants to, we have policy measures that can do that. One of the problems is that the public has come to accept with a certain fatalism that this is the way the laws of society work. In 1978, former German Chancellor Willy Brandt headed one of the first of the very famous international commissions, was called the Brandt Commission, and in the final report to the UN, he said, in this foreword, he said, "I believe that the problems created by men, by human beings, can be solved by human beings." And that awareness that the laws that are governing society have implicit or explicit in them value judgments, choices and decisions, which we need not accept inevitably as true, is a fundamental area where the academy feels awareness is very much lacking. I'll give just one example. When we talk in the field of economics, we frequently hear the term efficiency. The laws tell us what will be efficient, what will be the most effective, cost-effective way of achieving something. But what is the concept of efficiency that is being referred to? It is how to produce something at the lowest price and with the most efficient utilization of natural resources, hopefully, and make a profit or do it as a public service. That's a narrow economic concept of efficiency. But what happens if we look at efficiency from a social point of view? Is it efficient for us to say that 2/3 of the human population should be living, or 1/3 should be living on the borderline of survival, or that 2/3 should be undereducated and lack access to medical care that can extend their lives and make them more productive? Is it efficient from the society's point of view to have rising levels of unemployment which generate social unrest and instability around the world and overall diminish the security, welfare, and well-being of the whole human race? Well, when you look at the same equations and the same policies from the point of view of the society rather than of the economy or of the business or even of the government, sometimes you come up with very different answers because each of these terms is a value-laden term. And often we accept it as if it were an absolute concept rather than a relative concept. These are the types of things that we think need greater exploration. Another interesting area where I think the social sciences could aspire to benefit enormously is if we look at the unity and the integration of the natural sciences. There is, though different fields may differ, and some natural sciences today would like to have a more egalitarian principle. I think egalitarianism is good, but in certain things we recognize that there is a natural hierarchy in nature. And the principles of physics form the fundamental basis of that hierarchy. I'm not talking in terms of social prestige or social value or importance. I'm talking in terms of the fundamentals. And the principles of chemistry are built on that. And the principles of life chemistry are built on both of those, and so on. And I don't think a soil scientist or a geologist or a zoologist or botanist is going to argue about the fact that there are fundamental layers of reality beneath on which the foundations of their knowledge are built. But what about in the social sciences? It would seem kind of logical to assume that if the atom is the fundamental unit of matter and it consists of subatomic particles, that if we want to look at society, that we would have to say that the individual human being who has his own particulate nature, he's got so many things going on inside him all the time, represents the fundamental unit on which society is based. And if the atoms are linking and relating to one another and reacting with one another to form molecules and complex structures, we could say that sociology is the field in which these individuals relate to each other, interact with each other, form larger structures together, and that every other social science, whether it's economics or political science or law or management or anything else, should be based on a fundamental recognition of the principles that are based on in these other areas. But in practice, and again I mentioned there are generalizations always leave room for exceptions, but as a generalization, each of the social scientists kind of functions independently of one another. I kind of imagine it as floating in midair without a real platform of reality. Try doing physiology without talking about chemistry or physics or electrical conductivity and things like that, and how far would we be today? But this is the state where we are in most of the social sciences. That's related to another form of interconnectivity. If this is a vertical hierarchy, there's also what we call interdisciplinarity. Interdisciplinarity is a popular term for the last 40, 50 years at least. From my understanding, interdisciplinarity is almost inbuilt into the natural sciences, even when each discipline is focusing on their own territory. Because the knowledge of other disciplines, and particle physics may be, you'll have to tell me, but it may be not typical in terms of the natural scientists because you're at such a fundamental level. But clearly if you're talking about a geologist or a soil scientist or a meteorologist, a good example, he would not think of, and he could not come to any conclusions about the performance of weather without understanding, taking concepts and principles and knowledge from many, many other disciplines. And when it comes to ecology, there's almost nothing you can do if you're not willing to learn from all the other natural sciences. We have interdisciplinarity in the social sciences as well, but it tends to focus on problems, not on a fundamental knowledge. It tends to be we get people from a number of different disciplines together and say, what are we going to do about this problem? What are the economic implications? What are the political implications? But we're each talking from a different discipline with a different set of assumptions, different vocabulary, different principles, which make it problem-oriented rather than real integrated interdisciplinarity. I'm mentioning it because I think there's a scope, and we have examples of success in the natural sciences, which, let's just say, in all fairness, that the social sciences are a few hundred years behind in their evolution. They started later, and our knowledge is than the natural sciences, and that this is a greater challenges, greater complexity. We've got new dimensions that we have to take into account, and therefore it's going to take us time to do it. Our question is not to complain or find fault. Our question is there anything we can do to stimulate that process, to accelerate that? We think there is, and we think that a natural interaction, an interaction with natural scientists, we do it within the academy, but we think on a broader basis, can help accelerate this process of moving beyond. And one of the reasons I think that's possible is because the natural sciences particularly physics are held in such high regard and such esteem by the social sciences in general. And there's been such an effort to model the social sciences on what at least they believe are the principles and virtues of natural science, that when natural science has moved on, when physics has moved on, then an interaction in which the physicist himself says, we know that Newton's laws are not enough to fully explain reality, there are other factors, we think it can have an impact. Another very important area, all of these are interrelated, I think it's self-evident. It's not just that there's a fairly clear hierarchy in the natural sciences or that there's an interconnectivity, but if you go to a fundamental level, there are a common set of principles. Maybe with some exceptions that are true in your colliders that I don't know about, but generally atoms behave the same way, whether they're the atoms of a mineral or the atoms of a life form or of any object, whether they're in space or here. The principles that you have identified that constitute laws and characteristics pretty well are universal and immutable. But what about in the social sciences? Which are the principles on which our social sciences are based? Common principles. After all, whether I'm in a store buying something or running a business or voting or running a government or leading an army or out entertaining my friends, I'm still the same person. My psychology doesn't automatically change because I change my occupation, my profession, or how I'm spending my time. The society in which we live is doing all those things simultaneously. So there have to be, I think, fundamental principles that are common to all human activity, which means that would be common to all the social sciences. And yet, so far, we haven't identified too many of them. In fact, when you talk to most social sciences, they're not even looking for them. They're not even sure, many of them are not even convinced that they exist. Recently, in the last 3 or 4 decades particularly, systems theory has undergone very rapid development. And I mention it because I think it illustrates the fact that such common principles are there, and that we can learn a lot by looking for them and trying to learn from them. And now systems theory is maybe one of the first areas where the social sciences have begun to operate and look at fundamental principles that work whether you have a system that's handling information or a market that's handling financial transactions or international trade, or whatever it may be, information flows, networking in Facebook, or whatever it may be. There seem to be some common characteristics. And I take that as great encouragement that we're finally moving, at least in one area, to get to some common denominator that could govern all of the social sciences. I think there's another, I think there are many, but I just wanted to mention one more. Another area that could be really explored in which physics could help us a lot, and that's the concept of energy. I'll qualify it by agreeing it from the beginning. I am not proposing that the concept of energy as it's applied in physics is identical to the concept of energy I'm referring to in society, but I think there's a very valid parallel here. We were discussing over lunch, had a fascinating discussion, and one of the points mentioned was that physics could not really understand the behavior of forces until it had a clear conception of what energy was, what we really meant by energy. What we see now is there is a coherent theory that moves from the energy to force, to power, to work. That is, there is an energy, it becomes a force under certain conditions, it acts as a force under certain conditions, it generates a power, and it generates results. Well, in our society, in human relations, we are generating results all the time. And certainly energy is a fundamental input to the results that we achieve. Not just the physical energy that we consume in our machines, not just the caloric energy that we consume in our bodies, but there's an emotional energy, there's a mental energy that stimulates us to creativity. And what is the relationship between an emotional and mental energy and a physical energy? I will leave that for another discussion. But we're talking about something more than just, we are not just a physical body metabolizing physically. We are capable of aspirations, enthusiasm, inspirations, higher manifestations of that energy than simply our capacity to move an object physically. It was very interesting in our discussion about Cern over lunch today with the spokesman for three of your three largest projects. One of the things, maybe it was you, Wolfgang, I'm not sure who mentioned it, was leadership is really important in an organization, somebody to give a vision. What does a vision do? A vision sets a direction for how we should apply our energies. And when you set a direction for where an energy is going, we know what an unfocused energy means. It's the energy of a mob or a 2-year-old child who's just playing around purposelessly. But when we direct that energy towards a goal, towards a vision, towards an idea, the very act of directing it converts it into a force. To have the capacity to act on something to get a result. We know there are devices, physical devices, which if you apply a force through such a device, like a pulley or a lever, you can magnify, multiply the impact, the amount of work done by that force. We have tools like that, mechanisms like that in society. We call them organizations. Cern is such an organization. Cern takes the energy and capacities of thousands of people, not just the physical energy, the ideas and the enthusiasm. It directs it towards common goals, sets of objectives. It channels it through an organization, so it's not thousands of people working independently, but thousands of people working in some type of coordinated structure collectively to achieve results. It seems to me there's a parallel there. In 1960, after Sputnik and the moon, the competition between the Soviets and the Americans started, President Kennedy said that he set a national goal that the U.S. should land a man on the moon and bring him back again within 10 years. There was no known technology capable of getting to the moon at that time, but that was the easy part. They were pretty sure of it. The real problem was getting him back again. He set the goal, he set the vision. Maybe the energy came mainly from the sense of competition with the Soviets and the fear of of being second to the moon as we were second in orbit. But certainly there was tremendous national support for this effort. NASA coordinated the activities of more than 50,000 different organizations working on different pieces of this puzzle and put it all together and actually achieved it 6 months early. I think there's a parallel here. Maybe, as not being a physicist, I may have not done due credit to the physical principles, but I think there's a parallel here that we can learn from. If you see businesses we frequently see businesses that are doomed to failure. One instance was Apple Computers in 1998, when Steve Jobs came back to Apple after being thrown out 14 years earlier. Michael Dell, who by then was a multi-billionaire success, he says, my advice to Steve Jobs, if I were the CEO of Apple, would be to close the company. Within 10 years, Apple was the most valuable company that had ever been created. Was Michael Dell wrong? If you looked at the financial assets of the company, if you looked at the debt structure, you would have said, if you looked at the physical assets they had, you would have said this is a company that probably should close. Their track record certainly pointed to it. But a company is not just a physical thing. It has the capacity to release human energy, as Cern has done, in a remarkable way through an innovative structure, organizational structure that is similar, I think, to very few other research organizations in the world, which enables people to work with a wider latitude of freedom. And we know that in freedom we are more enthusiastic when we have a scope for presenting our ideas and following our own inspirations. There tends to be greater energy. That energy can lead to greater friction and conflict, or it can lead to greater results depending on the maturity of the organization. And you seem to have found a formula here that, compared to most research enterprises in the world, is pretty remarkable. What are the principles behind that? As a social reality that Cern is, this is society. This is a miniature of society. If there are principles governing your success, are there fundamental principles governing this success that could be applied not only to scientific research, but could be applied in business or could be applied in other activities as well? So the search for common principles, I think, is one of the important areas where a discussion and exchange could be helpful. In his novel War and Peace, Tolstoy referred to this phenomenon that you cannot tell the outcome of a battle from the mere physical assets of how many people you have and the strategic position and the munitions. There's another factor. He called it the spirit of the army. And his point was that that was what was going on in the confrontation between Russia and France at that time. Of course, one of the most dramatic instances of the difference that can be made by the spirit of the army was the Battle of Agincourt in late 1400s, when the English under Henry V, which has been immortalized and romanticized by Shakespeare and Henry V, but factually, as far as historians know, were a force of an English force tired out from a long campaign in northern France was confronted with a French military force that was far more equipped and probably somewhere between 2 and 4 times as large. Yet at the end of the battle, something like 6,000 or 8,000 French had been killed, and 132 Englishmen had been killed in that warfare. It defied any analysis through merely looking at the quantitative data of what was there on the ground. So obviously we know, whether we're in science or we're in business or we're on the battlefield, there are factors that determine how much our energy is released and how effectively it's utilized. Finally, there's a very important concept in social science for all of us, which is strangely neglected, and that is the role of the individual. In the natural sciences, we're interested in the generalizations that we can make, what we can find common about types of individuals, types of particles, or types of species, or types of elements, types of molecules, and all. But we have an added dimension here, and that is that each individual, although we belong to types, many different types, linguistic, ethnic, physiological, and so forth, psychological, and so forth, we also manifest characteristics that don't seem to fall into any particular type. And if we look at the relationship between the individual and the social collective, we see that the individual plays a unique role in the development and functioning of the collective. Popper was so convinced about this that he argued that the social sciences must center on the individual, almost to the extent of downgrading the significance of the collective to just a bunch of individuals. I can't agree with that. I think he went too far. I think what we need to do is recognize that the individual and the collective form a whole, an integrated whole. They don't exist without one another. No human being can be a full individual outside of society. We wouldn't have learned our language, we wouldn't have acquired our knowledge, we wouldn't have acquired our skills, we won't develop our emotional capacities, our communication capacities, and I believe our thinking capacities at all. We are social animals, and we are best in our interactions with the society. But the same thing is true of society. No society could develop if it were not for the innovations, the creativity, the diversity that's generated by releasing the initiative of its individual members. The individual is the adventurer, the pioneer, the inventor, the original thinker, the genius, the entrepreneur, the political leader, in whatever field it is. Our innovations occur first in the individual, and then they spread to the society, where they're replicated, assimilated, organized, so that what an individual has done, like an idea like Tim Berners-Lee, can be institutionalized and made available to the whole society. One of the remarkable things about individuality is that we seem to be getting more individual, becoming more individual over time. And I think the reason for that is society in the beginning, in the early stages of anthropological development, society's first priority was to ensure security of the group, which meant everybody should follow the same practices and customs, and we shouldn't have too much internal dissent. But today, the fundamental philosophy of a place like Cern, and to a lesser extent maybe, but in most functioning successful democracies, is that the society is benefited by allowing much greater individual freedom for self-expression, for creative thought, for exchange and initiative. Our social attitudes toward the individual have changed markedly. You can trace it back to the developments in Renaissance Italy about 400 or 500 years ago, but it's been growing and gaining momentum over time. Back in 1956, a middle-aged black woman in Montgomery, Alabama, got on a bus, and at that time there was segregation in Montgomery, and the blacks were put in the back of the bus, normally the last 4 or 5 rows, and the driver came to the blacks sitting there and said, "We have more white people on the bus today, so you have to move back to, when changing the partition, changing the rule, you have to move back to a further row." This woman named Rosa Parks said, "I'm not moving." Everybody else moved, she refused to move. The driver was polite. He said, "Look, madam, you know this is the rule, you have to follow it. If you don't, I'll be forced to call the police and you'll be prosecuted." She said, "You do what you want, I'm not moving." The driver called the police, she was arrested, she was put up for trial. She was given an $8 fine, because the last thing anybody wanted was to make an issue out of this, but she made an issue out of it. The result was that the whole black community in Montgomery, Alabama went on strike and refused to use the public bus system. Within 6 or 8 months, the financial viability of the public transport in Alabama, in Montgomery, had become so seriously impaired by the lack of revenue from the black bus travelers that they were forced to change the law. And this was one of the signal acts that started the American Civil Liberties movement for equal civil rights for the blacks. One individual. Whether that individual was a Rosa Parks or a Mahatma Gandhi, without Mahatma Gandhi, India, I'm sure, would have gotten their independence, but I'm quite sure they would not have got it non-violently, the first country to set that example of a non-violent independence movement. I don't know what would have happened ultimately in World War II, but the British historian Paul Johnson, in writing about World War II and Churchill, said that he's pretty sure, and I share his view, that England definitely would have lost the Battle of Britain if it hadn't been for one man, Winston Churchill. I don't know how many of us would be enjoying something like an iPhone, an iPod, an iPad, or something similar, or even a graphic user's interface, if Steve Jobs hadn't come along when he did and did it. Others may have invented something similar or better eventually, or Tim Berners-Lee, who had this crazy idea here at Cern. But clearly, the individual doesn't play a proportionate role in the development of the society. There's something I think we can learn from that in all fields. And that's not just an observable fact, but it has to be a scientific fact if our social science reaches maturity. I've touched on a few of what I think are interesting problems. I hope that might resonate with some of you, that could be areas which we could explore through some types of venues in the future. There are many others. The problem of uncertainty in physics and its relationship to free will, its relationship to the lack of limits in social development is a very interesting question. The question of entanglement, non-local connections, and the more I hear from the physicists, the less sure I am that I understand what you really think about it. But I think there are very interesting parallels there in society as well. The issue of causation. One of our fellows at the Academy is trying to found a new discipline. He calls it the discipline of anticipation. And by that what he means is, he said, because the social sciences are so much modeled on physical sciences, we tend to be looking for all our causality in the past, whereas it's pretty obvious when we reflect on it that as human beings we are driven very much by not just what has happened in the past, not just our past conditioning, but our future aspirations, expectations, fears, and anticipations as well. How should the future be factored into a more mature social science as we go on? And finally, the whole process of discovery. My understanding of the scientific method is that we spend most of our time trying to validate or falsify concepts and hypotheses. But all of that success depends on the quality of the concepts and the hypotheses themselves. And if you look back and listen to those great thinkers who have recorded or spoken about their own discoveries, at least many times, they use the word that something akin to or equivalent to intuition to explain how they arrived at the hypothesis in the first place. But if that's the case, shouldn't we, and I don't mean we just here, I mean shouldn't scientists, shouldn't both social scientists and natural scientists be trying to understand Is this simply a question of quantum uncertainty that leads to an intuition and an inspiration, or is there a process behind it? A process other than or a complement to or in addition to the process by which we try to falsify a concept once it's developed. I think we're not spending enough time as a collective scientific community on the process of creation. And when you look at the reasons or possible explanations for this, I think one of them, there may be more than one, is there are different patterns of thought, different ways of thinking that tend to lead to new ideas. One of them, which you're very familiar with because it defines the quest of particle physics today, is trying to reconcile phenomena that appear to be unrelated, opposite, or contradictory to one another. Newton did it when he looked at the motion and inertia. Maxwell did it with electricity and magnetism. And today, physics is struggling with quantum theory and relativity. Is there a principle behind this about the creativity of the human mind when we approach things, not just in terms of relationship and similarity, but we look for patterns of relationship between things that appear to be quite in contrast to one another? I hope that I've shared with you a little of the spirit of adventure that we feel within the Academy in posing challenging questions to ourselves. And I invite you individually and collectively, any of you who resonate with these ideas, we'd be happy to interact with you and explore the ways we could collaborate in future. Thank you. You want me to?
Okay, are there questions or comments? Please.
I have a question regarding your placebo effect you mentioned. I thought placebo effect is fundamentally related to the nature of a human being. There is a certain amount of placebo effect no matter where you are, who you are dealing with. But you're telling me that placebo effect is increasing in time?
This is what the statistics clearly show, and it's been a big problem for the pharmaceutical companies, yes.
By how much? What's the derivative?
That data is available. There is data available significantly, but I can't. I don't have it. It's a good question. I'd be happy to, if you give me a card, I'd be happy to pass on the reference to what it is. But it's a serious. I'm calling it a problem. I don't know if it's a problem or it means we need less drugs and more faith in our own capacity to cure or whatever it is. But it's a fact that. And it's interesting that though the medical profession as a whole is very well aware of the placebo effect, that it's quite understandable that the drug companies are not really very anxious to learn more about this, because they very well may find ways to enhance this impact. They're worried about the fact commercially that it is increasing. So you would think that there would be a lot more research going on to try to understand it and to try to find out why it's increasing or under what circumstances it increases. At least to my knowledge, there isn't. It's a fascinating issue.
Speak now.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think you told us quite convincingly that social sciences could learn from natural sciences and vice versa. I'm almost convinced. But let me take the point of view of the skeptics. I mean, taking one of your last examples. Indeed, in physics, one of our basic assumptions is that the particles of a certain class all behave the same. Same atom of a certain element will behave, as you said, everywhere the same way. You say in social sciences, individualism is more important. doesn't that mean there is a basic difference between the two, and the two cannot get together? That in principle it will not be possible to learn from each other?
Well, it's a wonderful question. I would argue even if we are very different, we can learn from each other by being aware of those differences, because the assumption, the primary assumption as a generalization in the social sciences, that people are types just like particles are types. And all we need to do is type them statistically. So we would learn something, I think, of fundamental importance to social science if we were clear that this is true. I don't know whether that conclusion is inevitable, because as particles fall into types with characteristic behaviors, at least there is something you call uncertainty, something that's unpredictable about the behavior of the particle. As far as we know, particles are not consciously deciding to rebel from one another or to rebel from the scientist, but at least with the individual, the human individual, we have reason to think that there are mental, psychological processes that are going on and not just conditioned reflexes. It's not necessary, and I didn't mean to imply that I think social science can only learn because of the similarities. I think social science can benefit equally if we were really clear about what the differences are. And I don't think that clarity is there now. In some cases we assume difference, and in some cases we inappropriately, and I think some cases we assume similarity inappropriately. It's worth an examination.
Are there other questions? Please.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment to support actually what you just said, and even in a more stringent way, in the sense that you started your very, very nice discussion by mentioning all the challenges we are faced with. And one of the challenges that we are faced with can be summarized in one word, which we can say is sustainability. Yeah. Can we be sustainable or not? And there I see that the role of science and social sciences and physical sciences coming together is absolutely essential. Yeah. Because that's where the physical sciences starts off by saying, oh, there are physical boundaries. I mean, you cannot say, it's just stupid to say that you continue extracting oil if the amount of oil that you need to extract that barrel of oil is exactly 1, so the 1-to-1 ratio. On the other hand, there is a value to society, there is all that complexity beyond the physical boundary that drives our behavior. And in order to achieve that sustainability, it is impossible to do it just by going out to telling people, look, these are the physical boundaries, and tomorrow they will change their attitude. That just won't happen. So we need this close alliance between these two fields. And so I'm very, very happy to see what you've done today, and to think that this is a very important connection we need to develop.
I have a very interesting, important comment, and I just have a quick response to it. I fully agree with what you've said. One of our, this message of sustainability is really only discussed in one context. What are the sacrifices we have to make in order to survive? It can be turned around, and we are just launching a project with 10 other organizations where we want to ask it another way. What is the optimal route for humanity that can meet all its objectives? How can we maximize achievement of all our objectives, and prosperity, obviously, living standards is one of them, peace and security and sustainability and freedom are others. Is there any way that we could use them to mutually reinforce one another, rather than like thinking of it, it's a zero-sum game and you have to take from this to do that? And remarkably, there's very little thinking done this way about, is there an optimal solution? Everybody says you want more jobs, you're going to have more energy consumption. You're going to have to have greater public expenditure, or you're going to have to reduce competition or something like that. It's because of the piecemeal approach. And that's one of the reasons we think, if you want a dream, something to dream towards, that ultimately we need to move towards an integrated social science, science of humanity, that sees all of these aspects, all of these activities as part of an integral whole. And we don't have that vision today. And I suppose it's taken physics centuries to evolve the kind of cohesiveness and integration you have today. Hopefully we'll, with the needs we have, the compelling needs we have, we can do it a little faster now with the experience you have as the base.
Are there any further questions, please?
I have some comments. You see, this concerns your examples. You see how the successful organizations can channel, you see, something what you call energy just by bringing the sum from physical sciences into social sciences. There is, however, a big difference between social sciences and physical sciences. You enumerated many of them, but I would like to draw your attention to probably the most principal one, which is the formulation of predictions. And in the context of the organizations, you see, you can, any social theory is unable both to maintain the same force that organizes individuals and organizations according to the goal, like, for example, putting a person to the moon, or, for example, constructing new supercomputer. So you neither can formulate a theory how to preserve, sustain this kind of approach, nor can you predict what kind of other activities that are bubbling, you see, all the time, will come into being and replace those activities that had this positive energy and positive power. So if you would be able to formulate some laws concerning this way how a big organization can sustain, you see, their goals on one hand, and on the other hand, that's the law that would somehow systematize what a condition has to be fulfilled in order to create this kind of activity. You would try to approach the physical sciences in terms of making some predictions, you see. So up to the moment that you are not doing this, you see, the gap is enormous in between physical sciences and social sciences. I don't know if this is clear what I am saying. Yeah.
I think it's a very valid point. And I didn't mean to imply that we're going to approach anything like the predictability in the social sciences. And theoretically, apart from the practical difficulty of doing it, theoretically, unless we really understand not just repetitive conditioned human behavior, but unless we really understand the creativity and innovation, we can't do that. So granted that there's an enormous distance, it doesn't mean that there aren't common principles or that much that we can learn. Just kind of anecdotally at the end of the discussion, back in 1994, I was researching for a book on management which was published in the States, and we went into 20 of the most successful corporations at that time, and one of them was Apple, another was Intel, and then you had some IBM and others. They were American companies. And at the end of this process, my co-author turned to me and he said, if you had money, it was an if question because I didn't, but if you had money to invest, which of the 20 companies that we went into today would you invest your money? And I said, well, I would make it Apple Computers. Within 6 months, Steve Jobs was thrown out of Apple. And by the early 90s, I was congratulating myself that I hadn't had money to invest in Apple at that time. And yet my co-author commented to me about 5-6 years ago, you see, you said 20 years ago that obviously it wasn't a prediction. But I think there were some characteristics that supported this, and Steve Jobs was not, I don't at all mean to imply he was the whole answer, but there was something to it that made it possible. We have to study this much more and learn much more in order to know. What I'm convinced is that looking at the financial statement of a company and seeing how much profit they're making or how much cash reserves they have is definitely not the basis on which you try to project the future success of a company. In 1978, Chrysler Corporation was the biggest American company to ever go into bankruptcy, and the consensus on Wall Street was within 6 months Chrysler would be closed. Lee Iacocca came in as the president at that time, and within 3 years Chrysler had made more money than they had in the previous 59 years of their existence. I don't think it was just a question of uncertainty or, chance. There were principles that governed the success which are beyond the complexity of current management science, but could be understood, that have something in common with Cern, something in common with other types of successful organizations. So granted, we're a long way from predictability, or from even being clear about what type of predictability is possible in human systems. It doesn't mean that we can't learn a lot more about how to make those systems successful and sustainable and capable of evolution.
Any further questions? Well, I would like to make a statement, iterating what he was saying, namely that somehow social sciences try to keep up, with developments and so on, but somehow it feels that is sort of too slow, because the change, the pace of change is accelerating all the time. Like the internet was not foreseeable, with its huge implications on everything, on business, lifestyle, information and so on, and this is accelerating all the time. And now there are people like Ray Kurzweil, probably, who predict some kind of intelligence explosion, explosion of artificial intelligence within the next century, overshadowing the human intelligence by an infinite amount. Yeah, I mean, these kind of things cannot be predicted.
Right.
So, indeed, I have the feeling that whatever is tried in social sciences will be surpassed by the actual development of completely unforeseeable developments.
All the more reason to try to accelerate the pace of our knowledge.
Absolutely true. Okay. Please.
Well, as you said, new things are coming up again and again, and this is certainly true, but at the same time, the way we as humans deal with these things it is questionable how different this is, say, from 2,000 years ago. So that is really something exactly, I think, what we need to study. And maybe to comment on, you're behind me, I really feel like, to me this was the discussion, like how far do we in social sciences need really to adopt the scientific methods from hard sciences, and I think there is, and I would have wished that you would address this much further. It is really questionable how much the social sciences do need to adopt hard scientific methodology, which sometimes leads, in my view, to rather doubtful scientific procedure in certain fields, such as psychology, which is too bad. So, thank you.
How much we can learn from each other.
Yeah.
Okay. Another statement.
Maybe
Okay.
we discuss it privately.
Okay. So, thank you for the discussion. Thank you for the nice talk.
Thank you.